Hello, everyone. My name is Ken, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this particular episode of the Two World Podcast. Quite often, you'll see three faces plus a special guest at times. Today, there are two faces, as one of the co-hosts, Barney, is unable to be here this morning, and we wish Barney the best and look forward to joining up with him again. Before I introduce I will introduce. Our other co-host then this morning is,
I'm Jacob. Good to be here, everyone.
yeah, thank you, Jacob. And this is a special treat for us today as we are welcoming to the Two World Podcast an author who has a book coming out very soon, which I'll tout here in a moment. But we do want to issue a heartfelt welcome to Karen Witemeyer. Thank you for joining us this day, Karen.
It's a delight to be here.
Yay. I'd like to tell viewers a little bit about Karen first, and eventually we're going to dive into her upcoming book, which is called Taming Lady Temperance. And this book will be out February the 17th, so very soon, very soon. A little bit about Karen first. She is a prolific writer. She has written many, many, many novels. She has been honored in a number of ways. She has won a Christy Award, a CFW Carroll Award, Holt Medallion. I'd like to hear about that one, Karen. Inspirational Reader's Choice. And she says she writes historical romances because she believes the world needs lots and lots and lots of happy ever afters. And how can we disagree with that? She's cross stitches. She loves drinking tea, and she is a gospel hymn singer and is sitting right now in Texas and has told us how nice the weather is there. And as Jacob and I are Ohioans, we're jealous but glad for her. She mentions and describes her husband as heroic for the things he does, and that's a very nice tribute to him. We encourage you to not only purchase Taming Lady Temperance, but to look into her other books and find the behind the scenes information at KarenWitemeyer.com. Karen, we're so pleased that you have chosen to join us this morning. So once again, welcome to you. Maybe we could start, for the sake of our listeners, viewers, and for Jacob and myself, talk a little bit about how you came to be a writer. Were you in second grade and that first essay set everything in motion? Love to hear about your past history.
Well, mine might be a little different from some writers. I never really thought I would be a writer. I just loved to read. I just loved stories. I was the girl that went to the library and came home with a giant stack of books and just wanted to spend all my time reading. I loved it. Loved getting lost in stories. As I grew, I was a good student. My teachers complimented my writing, but I didn't really think anything of it because that's academic writing. It's very different than writing fiction. But I used to like to daydream, as a young teenager. If my favorite TV series needed a better ending, I would rewrite it in my head, and those kind of things. I didn't really put it to paper. It all just kind of lived in my head. But after college, I had another professor who commented about my writing, and that time when I heard it, it felt a little more like maybe this is something I should pay attention to. And I graduated with my master's degree. I worked for about 5 years, and then decided to stay home and have babies. So I had 3 babies, and my husband actually went through a job transition where his position was being downsized. And so we had this moment of panic, like, uh-oh, I need to do something to contribute to the family income. And I know, I'll write a book and make lots of money right away, because that's always how it happens. I was so naive, didn't know anything. It took me 6 years to sell my first book. But that was kind of the little moment that pushed me past maybe someday to, no, we need to get serious about this and start doing it now. So I started attending conferences and learning everything I could about craft and practicing short pieces and moved into longer pieces and then finally had my first novel. So it was maybe a little bit different than a lot of writers who just feel like they're a writer from day one. It was a little bit different for me, but it was still a lot of fun to get there.
Wow. Did you attempt to self-publish at first, or did you find an umbrella to get under and have people help?
I I joined American Christian Fiction Writers, which is a national organization for Christian authors, and attending their conferences, I was able to meet editors and agents, and that's kind of how I got my foot in the door with a traditional publisher as a debut author. This was back in 2010 was when my very first book came out, and I was starting to write in the early 2000s, and that was really before independent publishing had taken off. It was still considered, like vanity publishing, and it was not held in very high esteem at that time. Plus, I didn't know enough about the industry to know what in the world I was doing with that. So traditional seemed like the only option that was available to me at the time. Now that I have progressed quite a bit through my career, I am starting to dip my toes into the indie publishing world, and I'm learning a lot. So
Mm. Hmm. Was all this done growing up in Texas? I'm sorry, Jacob, these are popping into my head, but I'll be quiet after this.
I actually grew up in California and then moved to Texas to go to school. So I attended Abilene Christian University. That's where I met my husband. And we're still in Abilene. I still work for the university. So
Ah,
we kind of got sucked into that culture and never left. But all of my books are set in Texas because this is my home now. And of course, all my kids have been born and raised here. And so, and Texas is huge. I've written 30 books and none of them, they're all in different places and they all have very different histories and all of that. So it's a great place to set stories, especially since I write about cowboys and the Western, kind of culture in the 1800s. So Texas is my home now, and I feel very connected to it, and I love being able to travel to places to research the settings of my stories and that kind of thing. So I'm a transplant, but I do really feel like Texas is home.
nice.
As you were mentioning there, your undergraduate experience and getting a master's at Abilene, I was wondering about the field of psychology and how maybe it has impacted you as a writer or informs the decisions you make or the way you think about characters.
Absolutely. I very rarely go into character development with, okay, what kind of neuroses can I give this character? And I don't approach it that way. But I really think a lot of that training is just kind of at the subconscious level now. So as I'm developing characters, different aspects of those personalities come out. I will say when I'm writing villains, which I have a few villain characters that I've given a POV to, there's some neuroses that come out with them. So, but I do think that it gives me maybe some background on what is healthy, what is not healthy, what where can the character grow, how do relationships work best, those kind of things. I think that training has definitely helped, even though it's more probably subconscious than anything else.
Mhm. Interesting. Karen, if I could, I'd like to, as we sort of dive into the book, and I was kind of chuckling in my brain as you were talking about giving characters neuroses and so on. It's so hard to not be a spoiler, so we're gonna give that great care, but this gives away nothing. It's just this was such a touching dedication in your book. I would really like to read it and get your reaction and response to that. To Hilda, you shared your son with me, but more than that, you shared yourself. You believed in my writing dream before I did, and even in your last days, you were quick to shoo me back to my office with the instruction, go write me another book. We shared a love of romance, a love of family, and a love of Jesus. Thank you for nurturing my creativity and being my second mom. Wow. Tell
Yeah,
us about Hilda.
Hilda was a very special woman. my husband's mother, obviously, and she passed away last April, and it was my husband and I were there at her bedside when it happened, but while she was in and out of the hospital for the last couple of months of her life, I often felt guilty that I didn't have time to spend more time with her, and she was always I mean, just the nature of who she was, "You need to go take care of your business. You can't help me with anything right here. You go take care." And she read all of my books. She gave them away to friends. She was probably one of my, one-woman marketing team out there, just so proud and so excited. And when I can't remember if I was married yet or just dating, but I remember her saying, "If anybody was gonna be an author in my family, it was either gonna be you or her son, Chad," who was also a very studious young man.
Mhm.
And it gave me confidence when I was, not very confident in trying something new, and she never once doubted that I would be successful, and she was always supporting me, always encouraging me, and they for the last goodness, I think probably 20 years or so, they've lived right next door to us, so they kind of were the ones that took care of my kids when I had to go back to work, and, so they've just been a very integral part of our family since I joined the family, and just feel so blessed to have had her in my life.
Wonderfully said.
As you were just opening up and sharing there, I was thinking about how intense the first year can be after a loved one passes away. I lost my own mom a little over 10 years ago. And I know that first year, like the first Christmas without them or their first birthday without them. And I kind of wonder about as you were writing this book and progressing through the journey of grief, did the experience of writing help you process some of your grief, or did you think of your writing as a way to honor her? I mean, obviously, these opening words that Ken just read do honor her, but I'm wondering if your writing was helpful to you as you were processing that loss.
Yes, I mean, this book was written, like, a year before, and
Ah,
so, the traditional publishing is slow.
okay.
So the book itself was already written when she passed, but I'm currently writing the next book in the series, and I do feel like some of that is helpful in there. Also, I think when she passed, I knew right away I needed to honor her in some way, and I hadn't yet finished all the last editing passes of this book, and so the dedication was just like, "That's what I need. I need this to be dedicated to her. That's gonna be kind of my tribute, my thank you to her." And watching my husband and my father-in-law and my sister-in-law also, they're they're having it kinda sneaks up on you, right? You seem to be doing fine, and then all of a sudden, boom, something hits you. And so being able to walk by them and hopefully be a source of support for them also.
Mm. Mm.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Karen, I have to admit, I don't know how much you watch television, but when you said they lived right next door, I was reminded of the show Everybody Loves Raymond, and I'm thinking that perhaps your experience was 1,000 times healthier, although they're doing it for comedy's sake,
Sure.
but
Well, when they very first moved next door, it took a little while to get used to, "Okay, there's other people in my kitchen, and there's" it took a while to kind of find those boundaries, but then after we did, it was a huge blessing. They look out for us, we look out for them, the kids are going back and forth between both houses. So, yeah, it was really a blessing in the long run.
okay. Well, it's a great story. Well, maybe we can jump into the book a little bit and get some questions answered that popped into all 3 of our brains here as we prepared for today. For me, maybe a starting point is to say, it's set in the year 1894. How did you choose that? It's 26 years before Prohibition. Maybe a little historical context there, please.
Sure. So my books tend to be set in the 1880s, 1890s. That's kind of my sweet spot. And so part of it was just a matter of comfort. It was an era that I'm more familiar with. But also when I started researching Albany, which is really only about 45 minutes away from where I live, but I had never visited. Isn't that sad? We have things like right in our back door and we never go. So I finally went. And they have some wonderful preserved history there. There's a fort, Fort Griffin, that's not very far away. It had closed in 1881 when the railroad came through, and so everybody then moved to Albany so that they could be where the railroad was, and they built a beautiful courthouse that's still standing today that was built in 1883. It's just a gorgeous, gorgeous courthouse. They still have the actual jail. They call it the old jail, and they turned it into an art museum, but it's still the original building, so I was able to go into the old jail and kind of get a feel of how the layout was and all of that. I love when I get to visit a place and get to see myself, where the characters might have been, what they might have seen, that kind of thing. And so setting it in 1894 allowed the town to be a little more established by the time my story takes place. So there are businesses, there's, families that have been there for a while and all of that. And so it allowed me to kind of jump into an established place and be able to kind of pick up from there. And you're right, prohibition didn't pass for quite a while, but all these, decades leading up to it is how it came to be. These women, and not just women, there were men too who were very pro prohibition, and they made a difference by, standing up for what they believed in their cities, their towns, that kind of thing.
Okay, great.
Was there something that surprised you when you were doing your research about this town or about this era that you weren't expecting?
Hmm. Not that I can think of off the top of my head, but I really enjoyed, I mentioned the courthouse. I was able to arrange for a private tour of the courthouse with a woman who knew a lot of the history. And so I didn't get a chance to work it into the story, but one of the tidbits that she shared with me that I thought was really interesting was, at the top of the courthouse is this big clock tower. And apparently it was the sheriff's job to make sure that the clock was keeping proper time and wound every day or however they they did that. And so at first I was like, I need to find a way to work that into my story because that's just a
Mhm.
really fun tidbit. I didn't find a way to do it, so I left it out. But that was kind of just a fun thing I learned from the tour I got.
So, as you're walking around, for instance, viewing the courthouse, having the tour, are you a person who takes a bunch of pictures? Are you a person that has a pad with them or a device to record thoughts? How does that work for you?
I do take a lot of pictures because that really helps me when it's time to describe things in my story. So having that visual is very helpful. I do jot down some notes. I'm not big into dictation, so I don't just say things as I'm walking around. But I like to take pictures and be able to reference those later as I'm writing those scenes.
Oh, okay. Interesting. As I'm trying to picture, you as an author in those situations, and it's certainly research, but yet
Mhm.
how does it come about? Sure.
I can imagine too, as you're thinking about the temperance movement, there's a lot of complexity to what was happening historically, different interests intersecting and parts of the community wanting different outcomes. Do you see any parallels or resonance with modern political life, or are there some lessons or connections that that era could make with where we are today that could be helpful?
That's a great question. I didn't set out with any particular agenda in mind or any message that I was trying to get across or anything like that. But I do think, as Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. People are going to be people. They're going to disagree about things. That's just kind of the nature of the human condition. And so I do think that while, Noreen starts off the story as pretty much, I mean, she's a little bit bold and brassy, and she doesn't care what anybody thinks, and she is very she's brave, but almost recklessly so. I mean, how she's trying to pursue her her passion, but as she gets to know James, and he helps kind of widen her view so that she doesn't just see the one thing in front of her anymore. She's starting to see maybe there's nuances to this. Maybe there's a different way to go about this that would be, you know, catch more flies with honey than than with vinegar, kind of thing. And so she has to learn that even though her passion and her zeal are important, there's other people to consider as well. And so I think that's kind of a something I hope translates to today's reader as well, is that yes, you can be passionate, you can be very brave about how you are approaching what you believe in, but you need to also pay attention to how that's affecting other people and take that into account with a dose of humility as well.
Sure. Well, you mentioned James. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about James Paxton. He's an 1890s law enforcement male person. How did you determine or decide that he would be an admirer and total respect for Noreen, who, to use one of your words, she was a prickly female, but he really, from the very start, sees something in her to respect and admire.
There's one scene later in the book where he mentions his family, and I think that he has very strong sisters and a strong mother. So they work the family farm. They are women who are not afraid to speak their mind but who love family and who are going to be there to help people. So he has grown up with strong women in his life. So even though he is a very low key, let's keep the peace, kind of person, he does still admire women who are willing to stand up for what they believe in and who are willing to put themselves out there instead of just letting the men carry everything. And so I think it comes back to his background and his mother and his sisters, and the relationship that he has with them, and that is part of what I see as letting him see something positive in her, where a lot of the men in town just see her as a pestilence, we need to get rid of her.
So, along with that, I mean, I really felt going through the book that James exhibited a lot of Christ-like characteristics. Was that purposefully done? I mean, we can get into a little bit about talking about forgiveness and so on, but definitely James, I felt like that.
I think whether it wasn't necessarily intentional on my part setting out, but I kinda let the characters determine, how they're gonna interact with each other. Noreen was the one who had the bigger personality, the bigger issues. She had the most emotional baggage that she had to carry. She had the most growth to do over the course of this story. She had a really big character arc. So I didn't want James to also have this huge character arc because then they would both be having too many issues. And to me, that didn't feel very realistic for them being super supportive of one another. So while she's going through these big things, he is there to be the support. At first, it's a friendship. He's wanting to support her, to encourage her, to maybe help her tone things down a little bit when that needs to happen. But he's there to kind of be the steadying force in her big arc that she's going through. She can be very passionate, but she can also have these times where she's just falling apart because she's dealing with guilt and with a lot of pain that's happened in her backstory and all of that. And so having someone there who he comes from a much more stable home than she did, so he kind of has this background. He's also the middle child, so he's used to kind of playing peacemaker with others. So he just naturally fits into that role of I'm going to be here to help you and to you know just be your support system. So that's kind of how I pictured him, not so much as kind of a Christ figure, but as someone who just comes alongside and wants to support and help you become the best version of yourself.
Yeah, that helps.
When you were writing, was it hard at times to balance this conflict between the two of them as they have these different callings for Noreen for temperance and for James to maintain the peace? And balancing the tension with their romance, these ideological differences, and then how they're longing to connect more with each other. Did that tension ever strike you as, "Oh, this is how do I resolve this?" Or were there times when you could feel it was hard to move forward or
Yeah, the opposites attract. It's, it's common, but it's difficult too because, there has to be a reason why these two people are going to be able to stay together, right? There may be physical attraction that's bringing them together initially, but there has to be some kind of core value that they can share in common that's going to help them get through the other things where they might have some disagreements on. And so if you look deep within both of them, even though at the surface they seem to be disagreeing, their core values are about making the community better. They both want to make the community better. He, as a law enforcement officer, keeping people safe, keeping the peace. She, wants to close down the saloon so that there aren't drunkards that are beating on their wives and their children, and that kind of thing. So at the core level, they really have the same value. And so then it's just as they work together and learn to see each other's point of view, then they're able to kind of even things out, and those opposite things now become more commonalities.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm.
Interesting.
I really like what you're saying there. I feel like that's another dimension to what you were unpacking for us at the beginning when you're talking about the value of the insight of this story to modern life and politics. Like for people who are genuinely trying to see what the other is trying to do that they may disagree with, and maybe there's common ground that we don't always see at first that emerges that can lead to mutual respect or partnership. I just really like what you're highlighting there. I think that's really
Mhm.
healthy and needed in our time.
Mhm. Yeah. I do wanna ask this one, particularly from Barney because I know just the way he wrote it, he was very moved. He was talking about the end of chapter 4, quote, "But a man as dedicated to the law as James Paxton would despise her if he ever discovered the sins of her past. God might forgive, but in her experience, people rarely did." End quote. He said Barney said, it felt like to him, the first half of the book felt kinda like it might have been fun and easy to write, and then the story turns more serious and we experience conflict and we experience, differences of passions. Did it become harder to tell the rest of the story? How did you feel there?
Emotionally, yes. I mean, I had to really dig deep to be able to find what Noreen was really struggling with. And even though at some level at the beginning when I first sat down to write, I knew basically, what her backstory was, but I didn't know all of the nitty-gritty details until I got into the actual writing process. And that's when they started to reveal themselves, as I'm writing it. So part of that was the discovery of what all those details were, and then trying to put myself in her shoes and imagine what am I going through if that's me, if I was that little girl, hiding from her dad, or if I was, having to go through the things that she went through and the guilt that she felt because of things that she did or didn't do. And don't want to give too much away, but she had to deal with a lot of things. And as a Christian person, I think the hardest thing for me to balance was she believes that she's dealt with this. She thinks she has. She believes that God has forgiven her for the thing that she felt responsible for, but there's still something blocking her growth there. She's still kind of stuck there. So, and I think we kind of lie to ourselves like that too. We think, "Oh yeah, I've dealt with that. That doesn't bother me anymore." And then something happens and it triggers you, and all of a sudden, "Oh my goodness, all this stuff comes back that I wasn't expecting." And so I think she's kind of dealing with that, where at some level she feels like she's in a good place with God, but and this is very true. People aren't as quick to forgive as God is, and they have long memories and they hold things against you, and it can be very difficult. And so she in her mind, if she confessed her past, all of the details to James, he wasn't, he's a law abiding guy. He's going to turn his back on her because he would have no other choice. And so that's keeping her from being completely honest with him, which of course causes a barrier in their relationship. And at some point, she has to reach rock bottom where she's finally able to just, okay, I'm going to have to tell you everything. And if you turn away, you turn away. But we can't keep going on with this kind of surface level relationship anymore. So I think that maybe that's part of where my psychological training has come in is as, we know these things that we think we deal with, but we really are just repressing them and all of a sudden they come back and we have to deal with them at some level at a healthier way.
Mhm. Yeah, and I could see that too, where Noreen's tendency, again, thinking she's taken care of a few things, but yet she really pushes any signs and overtures of affection toward her, pushes those away, and, yeah, there's yet to be resolved feelings that way too. Oh.
I'm kind of wondering as you are this is like a more general question about being an author in general, just for a moment to step back from the specific
Sure.
line of questions. But as you're writing about themes of forgiveness and characters working through challenges in their relationship, I guess I'm wondering, I mean, how much has been being married for over 30 years infused your writing with insights into like lessons you've learned about conflict transformation and growth and working through things with a partner. I mean, do you feel that there's a sense in which your lived experience with your husband has really infused in your books an insight that you kind of draw from regularly? And
Oh, I'm sure that's the case. I'm sure that is. Thankfully, we have not gone through all the conflict that shows up in my book. So that's that's
Mm.
a really good thing. But there are just some general things. I mean, I don't think you can have a healthy relationship without forgiveness. I just think that's something that is necessary in order to have a deep, meaningful relationship that can keep moving forward. That just has to be a part of it. There has to be a level of humility. You have to be able to step back from what is, what I am super passionate about, but maybe you're super passionate about something else. Okay, how can we support one another in that instead of me just demanding, oh, you have to do it my way? So I definitely think that over the years, I'm hoping that I've gained some wisdom through that, and it's very nice that I'm married to a wonderful man who is very supportive, so it really helps develop those heroes, being really good guys because I'm married to one, so it's I definitely think it plays a role.
Mm. Do you find people coming to you for advice, especially readers who have been through the experience of several of your books? I is there a circle of friends? Is there how does that work for you?
I don't know that people besides my children come to me for advice very often, but I do get reader letters, and that's the very best part of being an author is getting those letters from readers that say something about my story really touched them. And I love hearing, oh, it was such a good read. I just kept turning those pages and it was wonderful. Those are great. But the ones that really touch my heart are when somebody reaches out and says, I've been struggling with something just like this character was, and your book really spoke to me and helped me heal. When I get those kind of letters, that's when the goosebumps come and I just know this is why I write. This is the whole reason behind it.
Okay. So what comes to mind for me then is when James and Noreen are talking about Taggart, who is really Noreen's nemesis for our viewers here in this novel. Noreen says that Taggart doesn't deserve salvation, which is kind of an offshoot of forgiveness in a way. And then James, this is one of your finest moments, by the way, turns around and says, "None of us do." How did you craft that sort of interplay? Because that's a critical moment of contention between them, philosophically, psychologically. How did you come to that point?
Yeah, as Noreen and James are figuring out how to support each other and his views are very different than hers. His hands are somewhat tied cuz back in this day and time unless someone pressed charges, the law couldn't just go in and interfere with what's happening within a private home. And so Noreen, is like, you need to go in there and fix everything and save everybody. And he's like, I can't unless, somebody says, if the wife comes out and says, hey, there's been assault, I need help, his hands are kind of tied. And so she's frustrated that he won't do more. And he's frustrated that she doesn't see his point of view. And so they're kind of going back and forth. And of course, the saloon owner is where she's put all of her angst. So he is her villain, right? Because if he was just gone, this problem would be so much smaller and everything would be much better. And so he has become Taggart's become the focus of her mission. And because of that, though, she has no sympathy towards him as a person, right? He has become this characterized version of a villain. And I once heard somebody say, even a villain is the hero in his own story, right? You need to be able to see a person from their perspective, with their backstory, all the struggles they have gone through, what has caused them to become the person that they are. And really, he's just trying to make a living. He's not really doing anything awful. He's just running a business. But she can't see that because in her mind, he is the villain, right? He is evil. He needs to go away. And James is trying to get her to see he's just a person trying to make a living. It may not be in the way you think is appropriate. There may be repercussions to, what he does that need to be dealt with, but he's just a person. And, I think that's one of the biggest messages of grace is none of us deserve it. We all have failings. We all fall. We all make mistakes. We all hurt people, whether we intend to or not. None of us deserve it. And I mean, that's why Jesus had to be perfect and had to make that ultimate sacrifice for us because we couldn't do it ourselves. And so that's the message that James is trying to remind her of is none of us deserve it. It's only because of grace. And I think that moment is kind of where things click with her. And she has to stop and she has to think because she knows that's true. But she didn't realize how far from that she had gotten with the way that she viewed what was going on. And I think we see that in today's world too. We're so quick to villainize each other and not be able to see I'm just a person that has my own, experience and background that's informing what I'm doing. And I think we need that level of humility to realize that we're all the same at some level. We're just dealing with our own stuff the best way that we can. And I think having that level of humility opens us up to healing because until we let the wall down, we can't find that healing.
Very fair. Amen.
Amen. Well, Ken was just mentioning, as you were right before responding to this question, how he really loved that line that none of us deserve it. And that was one of his favorites from the book. As you look back on the book from this point, is there a line or a scene or a moment that really stands out to you that is one of your favorites that you just really value?
It's been a while since I've written it, so I don't really remember. But I love humor, and I try to incorporate some humor into my stories. And so instead of picking out my favorite line, because I would have to go back and try to remember what it was, I pulled out there've been a couple of early reviews that have come onto Goodreads, and so I pulled out one that had a quote that one of the readers found that she really liked. And so this was a quote from earlier in the book from Noreen's point of view. That man and his obnoxious charm, good grief. She'd almost shared a smile with him. So it's kind of that lighthearted, she doesn't want to be attracted to him, doggone it, but he's just so charming.
And seemingly, even in their most dire moments, he would work so hard to get Noreen's smile and get Noreen's just feeling a little bit better about the day and life is yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good. Hmm. Well, I will ask one more. This is very particular, and it's, because I quoted the page, but that's not the real important part. But on page 74, you talked about the qualifications of being in one's life. I'm gonna ask you if that was, a moment of personal reflection for you, and I ask that because it 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 caused me to put the book down for a few moments and think about what it means in my life to be in one's life. How does that feel for Jacob and I as friends? How does that feel with my wife Angie and I as a couple? Elaborate, please.
Yeah, that was one of those moments where it just kinda came out as the characters were working through things, it just kinda came out, but it did make me kinda stop and pause for a minute, because we talk about she's talking about the different men in her life, and that's the in her life I think you were talking about,
Mhm.
and, she's thinking of, like, her father, her stepfather, and now James, and she's trying to figure out, well, is James really in my life, or is he not in my life, and how are we defining that? And it is kind of a hard question because you have people that come in and out of your life all the time. You have the waitress that brings you food, okay, but she's not really in your life, right? Because she's not a meaningful, impactful person in your life. But then y a woman gives birth to a baby. That person is now in her life, and that's gonna make a huge impact on how she lives the rest of her life. And so I guess it is kind of hard to decide, if you stop and think, where does that line go of you are in my life, you are not in my life? And I think it probably changes over time. There are, like, for instance, my kids will always be in my life, right? But now I'm an empty nester. And so now they're off having lives of their own. So even though I'm still kind of in their life, I'm more on the periphery of their life than right smack dab in the middle of their life. And so it's one of those things that just kind of ebbs and flows as life changes. But it also, I think, for me, one of as an empty nester, as my children start to leave, I have decided in my heart that I wanna make sure I am in their life. I don't want to become, "Oh, yeah, we see mom once a year," and, I don't wanna become the out of your life mom. I wanna be involved. And so what am I gonna do to enhance those relationships? Well, I'm gonna stay in touch with them. I'm gonna text, I'm gonna call, I'm gonna ask what's going on in their life. I'm gonna visit. What can I do so that I stay in their life? And so it may be that since that's the stage of life that I'm in, that may be more of what prompted that thought from my end is not so much who is coming in and out, but how am I staying involved in other people's lives so that I am considered in their life? And so kind of maybe the other side of that question as well.
Hmm. Do any of the 3 show a propensity for writing, or are they on their own trail? Different
So I have a
different
girl and 2 boys, and my daughter's the oldest, and she loves writing. She's read all my books, she's a big reader also, but she's actually a computer science math person, so she's about to get her PhD in computer science, so she's not just the English major, but she loves to write just kind of as a hobby, and I think because she grew up seeing me do that, and so she feels she's always loved stories and books too, and so she enjoys writing, and she's hopeful that maybe one day down the road that she'll be able to have something published too. And so it's fun for me to see her pick up those pick up that hobby and hopefully maybe someday turn it into something that's a profession as well.
nice.
Well, before we conclude our time together, I just want to ask, are there any other details about your book or maybe bits of information that you want to share with our audience about where you are right now as an author? Oh, thank you, Ken, for holding that up. Or other upcoming projects? Anything that you want to mention at all just to our audience before we close this time?
Sure, absolutely. Well, Taming Lady Temperance is book 1 in a new series, and the series is the Secret Society of Spinsters. So within this story, not only is it a romance between Noreen and James, but there's the establishment of this spinster society, and the spinsters are all different ages and backgrounds. So, one of the founding members is in her 60s, and then another is, in her 30s, and they're working together and they're trying to kind of reclaim the spinster label. And so I even just a couple days ago had a note online from a reader who said, I don't like the term spinster probably because I didn't get married until I was in my 40s, and it just, it feels like old maid. I don't like it. And so, I mentioned to her, well, one of the things about this is they're trying to reclaim that word and use it as kind of they're reframing it. So it's now going to be a badge of honor for them that it's not because, oh, we're unmarried and we're single, but we're a group of women who want to make our community better. And we see value in what we have to bring because we're not as caught up with our families and that kind of thing. So we have more freedom to be able to do more to help the community. And so that's the idea behind the Spinster Society, which is kind of ironic because by the end of book three of the main members are going to no longer be spinsters because they they find their men and they go that way. So, but that's kind of the idea behind the series. And then I'm also, I mentioned earlier, I'm doing a little bit of indie pubbing on the side. So I had a series called the Texas Ever After series that took well-known fairy tales and gave them a Western twist. And I did 3 of those with Bethany House and had so much fun. I wanted to keep doing a few more. And so last June, I independently published my first one, which was To Love a Beast, which is a Beauty and the Beast story. And I'm just finished writing the next book in that one, which is called Part of Your World, which is The Little Mermaid set in Galveston, Texas. And so that's been a lot of fun too. So that'll come out in June.
Wow. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Karen, for sharing that information with us and for being with us here today for this interview. It was such a joy to get your responses and get to know you a little bit more. We're so appreciative.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it was our pleasure.
And for our audience, thank you for coming along with this journey and the interview. And we hope that as you heard about not only the book, but also some of its deeper themes of forgiveness, humility, recognizing something important in the other, that maybe there's some way that you were inspired by this content. And we encourage you to read the book and also the upcoming series. So thank you again for being here. And until next time, goodbye.